Mr. President, as you know, organising the lineup for tonight's debate has been far from straightforward. I would venture to say, however, that it's turned out rather well. For my part, I can say that I'm really rather relieved that a certain Mr. George Galloway's schedule has not allowed him to come and speak this evening. My job has become a great deal more pleasant and possibly a little bit easier. That is not to say, Mr. President, that we don't have a formidable proposition bench this evening. Molly McParland is a tireless and illustrious servant of the Union's competitive debating team, a past winner of the Moscow Open and convener of the hugely successful Oxford Women's Open competition. She now spends a huge amount of time and effort on Access for the Society, engaging underprivileged children and women in debating. Deborah Haynes is the defence editor of The Times and has a wealth of experience in Iraq to bring to bear in tonight's event. A highly celebrated reporter, Deborah won the inaugural Rat Up a Drainpipe Award in 2008 for her stories about translators working in Iraq. This depth of understanding will be crucial to this evening, and we on the opposition stand warned to leave no gaps exposed in our argument. Deborah spoke to something called the Oxford International Relations Society in a slightly smaller room than this last year, and I very much hope she enjoys appearing on a larger stage this evening. Finally, Mr. President, we have Mr. Andrew Mitchell MP, the former president of another smaller debating union somewhere in East Anglia. Sorry. Mr. Mitchell has admirably struck off that blot on his record and has had a hugely varied and successful political career. He's worked extensively in the developing world as a UN peacekeeper and held cabinet positions for international relations and as chief whip. Mr. Mitchell originally voted for the war in 2003, so you might say his position on the subject has shifted like the testimony of a Downing Street policeman. That aside, no. That aside, his experience of conflict resolution in the developing world make him a fantastic addition to this debate, and we're lucky to have him. Mr. President, these are your guests, and they are most welcome. Now to the motion before the House. I'll first draw attention to some of its features which are crucial for our discussion this evening. First, what is meant by the Iraq War? We define the war as the Western military action that led to the deposition of Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist regime and the subsequent efforts to stabilise Iraq and facilitate transition to freedom and democracy for the Iraqi people. Secondly, it is vital that we keep in mind that this debate has a broad historical and geopolitical perspective. We need to make our assessment this evening on how the Iraq War will be judged in terms of its macro-scale consequences, not on how it is currently perceived. Further, our debate is not so much about how the war happened, or even, as we've heard, for the stated aims of that war. The fact is that it is happening, and given that it did and is, will its outcomes be judged favourably or not? It is a debate about Iraq's past and its future more than its present. The opposition is not to be confused with the US and the UK government and their arguments about the war. It is perfectly possible to agree with the stated aims of the war and still argue that history will treat it favourably. It is worth adding here, however, that in our argument we will never seek to downplay the awful loss of life, violence and cruelty that have taken place and are taking place in Iraq. Nonetheless, it remains our responsibility in the West to imagine the alternatives, and that is an essential part of our debate this evening. Mr. President, for this motion to stand, we need to be convinced that things in Iraq and the Middle East are and will be, without doubt, worse than they are if there had been no intervention or a significantly different one. You can only regret something in this context relative to the alternatives. We contend not only that such evidence does not exist, but that there is clear evidence that the war has and will have beneficial consequences for Iraq and the Middle East. To begin the case, I'll focus on the following: the evils of Saddam and his regime, the lack of an alternative to Western intervention, and finally the positive consequences of the war we can already see, even in the apparently dire situation in Iraq today. We've just heard that Saddam Hussein was a bad man, but not a dangerous man. That is a notion that I hope very much to dispel for you this evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's curious, really, that so little coverage is given to the realities of Iraq under Saddam, as they are central to the question of Western intervention in the country. Saddam's Iraq has been described as a concentration camp above ground and a mass grave beneath it. This was a state where dissent meant death, where freedom of expression meant death, not only for you, but for your family. The entire apparatus of Saddam's power was set up to prevent his deposition, and he brutally put down any hint of opposition with torture and execution, at the expense of thousands and thousands of lives. There was absolutely no prospect of democracy or the advancement of personal freedoms under Saddam, or of the unseating of him and his sons without foreign intervention. We know this because the CIA extensively examined that possibility and concluded that it was impossible. Further, he repeatedly used chemical and biological weapons against his own people, killing as many as 5,000 Kurds in a single day at Halabja. He started a war with Iran which cost 1 million lives. His repeated and flagrant breaches of UN treaties on genocide and non-proliferation meant that the sovereignty of Iraq was forfeit and its people were the responsibility of the international community. The only responsible course of action was to remove Saddam, and the invasion was the only way to achieve it. A note on WMD here. So it's true, Molly says, that there was little evidence once the war had started, but there is also now evidence that envoys of Saddam were engaged just days before the coalition invaded in meetings with North Korean officials through something called the AQ Khan network in the purchase of weapons of mass destruction. There is a huge amount of evidence that Saddam was incredibly skilled in deceiving and in hiding the evidence of his weapons activity. We've discovered buried weapons sites and uncovered the sales and removals of weapons. Fast forward to the present day. Iraq has a constitution that was debated on 6 television networks and in 3 newspapers. It's had 2 rounds of democratic elections. Under Saddam, owning a satellite dish for your television was enough to get you killed. Now consider, this is important, the last 10 years if Saddam was still in power. The argument that we've heard that Iraq would at least be stable and relatively peaceful if still tyrannically oppressed does not hold. The situation in Syria shows us that much. Assad is a lesser version of Saddam, if you like. It is perfectly reasonable then to assume the following about the last 10 years in the region. The Arab Spring would have come to Iraq, and Saddam would have attempted to brutally crush it. He would have been unsuccessful just as Assad has been unsuccessful. He would have used chemical weapons against his people and would be entrenched in a similarly bitter and bloody civil war, probably a worse one. ISIL, or something similar, would still exist, just as it exists in Syria. This may seem to be an admission that the war has changed nothing, that the Iraqi people are as badly off as they would have been, and that the war has done nothing but added to their afflictions over the last decade. But to appreciate the difference in the scenarios, we require an understanding of 2 things about Iraq. First, a historical perspective on Iraq and the Middle East. Iraq is an intrinsically unstable and divided country, as are many of the countries Mr. Sykes and Mr. Pico created with their straight lines on Middle Eastern maps. The only thing that had held such an ethnically and religiously diverse country together had been Saddam's reign of brutality and of fear. Secondly, the geopolitical importance of Iraq. The country is caught between the Shiite forces of Iran and of Syria and the Sunni influences of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. All of these players have an interest in what happens in Iraq and have tried and do try to influence events and secure power by proxy in Iraq. In light of those insights, we have to ask ourselves the following questions, Mr. President. When has a country ever made the transition from despotism to democracy without conflict and bloodshed, let alone a country as complex as Iraq? And should anyone with an appreciation of history be surprised that there was sectarian conflict in the aftermath of Saddam's fall? Leading on from that, ladies and gentlemen, the reason that Iraq's post-war situation is better than the alternative, the reason that the Iraq war will not be regretted, is that its fledgling democratic institutions were protected from overthrow by any of the country's interest groups and their foreign backers by coalition forces. It is better because there is an international coalition committed to the destruction of ISIL, including the Kurdish people, who Saddam did his best to eradicate, but who are now democratic, autonomous, and committed to their role in the future of Iraq. And it is better because the West has a vested interest in the establishment and success of a new democracy in an incredibly complex and dangerous region. It is making clear its commitment to support it, as well as encouraging others to do the same. None of this would be true had the war not happened, and Iraq's future would be much more unsure as a result. Mr. President, the conflict in Iraq will be viewed in the context of the Arab Spring, the ongoing struggle by Arab peoples to break free from tyranny and to secure their own rights in free, democratic and just societies. It's a fight for things that we not only take for granted, but which have been hard fought for and hard won in the West over the centuries. It is interesting to note that all of the Iraqis we invited to attend this evening wanted to speak on this side of the House. It is truly a shame that none of them were able to join us. But we have heard time and again pleas from around the Arab world for Western support. In Iraq, we have answered them and we continue to do so. To say that our actions will be regretted by history shows a paternalist, even an imperialist mindset that will not be shared by those who judge us. Mr. President, if democracy, if personal freedom is important for us, it must be important for all people, for the Iraqi people also. I beg to oppose.